A apresentação tem quanto tempo, mais ou menos, Isabel?
A apresentação deve ser 40 minutos.
Ok, boa.
Ok, podemos começar.
Dá-me só um minuto.
Ok.
Já estamos na hora. Ok, bora, pode. I think we were online. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last session of this year's edition of Ciclo de Conversas, Design and Multimedia. So this is a cycle of talks organized every year in the context of the bachelor and master degree courses of Design and Multimedia of the University of Coimbra. My name is Nuno Coelho. I'm be moderating this session. Our host today is Isabel Duarte. Before giving the floor to you, Isabel, first of all, thanks for accepting our invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I just briefly present your work before giving the floor to you. So, to everyone who is watching us, Isabel Duarte is a designer, PhD researcher interested in the intersections between feminism and design history. In 2020, Isabel started Errata, a feminist revision to Portuguese graphic design history, a research project aiming to uncover the invisible stories of women designers in Portugal and investigate mechanisms of historiography that allowed these women to be forgotten. So Errata, which can be accessed on the errata.design. Isabel also published the Errata podcast, which is also available at the website. The podcast documents and reflects on issues facing women designers in Portugal through conversations with thinkers, curators, historians, and designers about their experience and work. So without any further delay, Isabel, thank you again for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nuno, and everyone behind the Ciclo de Conversas Design e Multimédia. For the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure. Like Nuno said, my name is Isabel Duarte, and I'm a designer and a researcher from the Center for Design History in the University of Brighton, where I'm doing a PhD on design history with a grant from Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia. Just to give a little bit of context about myself, I have a BA in graphic design and MA in editorial design, both from Faculdade de Belas Artes of Porto University. And in the 12 years after I finished my MA, I lived in London, where I worked mainly as an editorial designer in different studios. For example, I worked with Simon Esterson for a few years, designing several projects, amongst them the design magazine called I. And in my last years, I worked as the designer of Art Review and Art Review Asia. And recently, I changed my practice more to researching. And I've been developing for the last 2 years a project called Errata that is focused on the invisibility of women in design history in Portugal. Errata's first public presentation was an exhibition in Porto in 2021 and is also an ongoing podcast, like Nuno said. The motivation for Errata was at the beginning a very personal one. In the years that I was a student, and then after as a practitioner, I lacked women role models. I was surrounded by women as colleagues, as a student, but even though the classroom was full of women, my design teachers were all men. And then as a graphic, also the references we were given in classes were mainly of white male designers. And then as a graphic designer, my superiors happened also all to be men. And at a certain point around 2019 or so, I wasn't sure if this was a personal problem or a result of my environment, but I decided to went out and look for texts and other material about gender imbalance in design. And I found a lot of things. I found several articles, books, essays, podcasts about this. For example, today I bring a couple of infographics that I find very interesting. They're not designed by me. This one, for example, is designed by Silva Baum. And these infographics represent a part of this discussion really well. This one is part of an article that you can access in Ion Design, called "We Survey Gender Representation at Design Conferences Again, and Not Much Has Changed." And this one shows you that in 2019, in design conferences, there were more men than women speakers on those conferences, and even less non-binary folk. Another infographic, also from an article on Ion Design, this one is designed by Tala Safier, shows an even more interesting fact, I think, that in a specific Biennale, Brno Biennale of 2018, even though again, there was less women speakers than men. There were 65% men, 34% women. But then what's interesting to see is that on stage, when they counted the time spent on stage by men and women, even though women were 34% of the speakers, they only took 22% of the time on stage. And I think this represents very well not just how women are less represented in design events, but also how they're given less space on stage and less space to talk and to exist. While I was doing this research, I came across a very important text that made a big impact on me. And this was a text written by the British historian Cheryl Buckley, called "Made in Patriarchy: Towards a Feminist Analysis of Women in Design." And she says women have been involved with design in a variety of ways as a practitioner, theorists, consumers, historians, and objects of representation. Yet a survey of the literature of design history, theory, and practice would lead you to believe otherwise. Women's interventions, both past and present, are consistently ignored. This text in particular talks about design history. So then I was changing my direction a little bit, not just thinking about how women are not represented in conferences and in the present, but started to look towards the past. And this last sentence, "women's interventions, both past and present, are consistently ignored," stayed with me for a really long time. And from reading this text and from seeing those infographics and a lot of other texts and things, I understood that my personal situation was only a reflection of a systemic problem that affects everyone and has been present for a very long time. This text is from '86 and not much has changed. Then I decided to look more closely to the Portuguese context. And in Portugal, I think this is even more flagrant than in the UK, where I was living at the time. There isn't a lot of literature in Portugal about design in comparison to other countries, but in the last 10 years, 2 different collections of monographs were published by 2 different published publishers and organized by different teams. The first 15 books that you see in this image belong to a collection called Coleção D, that is still active, still publishes. This collection is organized by the designer Jorge Silva and published by Imprensa Casa da Moeda. The other 13 belong to Coleção Designers, organized by José Bartolo and edited by Exada Idea. These collections are very important because they're trying to fill a gap in design literature in Portugal, and they can be a tool for researchers and students. But of these 28 books, only one is written about a woman, Ana Salazar, a fashion designer. And at this point, I'd like to go back a little bit to Cheryl Buckley's text and remember that she used the word patriarchy in her title. And in her text, she talks about how women are seen through the lenses of patriarchy. They are defined by their gender as designers, or users of feminine products, or they're subsumed under the name of their husband, lover, father, or brother. These are Cheryl's words. She explains that in some areas of design, women are consistently considered as being more suitable for some areas of design. For example, jewelry, ceramics, textile design, fashion design, interior design, illustration, etc. All these subjects that are more detailed, more decorative, more connected to domesticity, and to attribute these characteristics to women and to think that they're more appropriate to these certain areas of design is to see women through a patriarchal lenses. It's defining them by their gender. And I believe that that's why it's even more problematic that in the one woman chosen for this collection is a fashion designer. So the combination between the lack of women in my professional path and the lack of references as a student and the lack of women in the literature in Portugal motivated me to look for women in graphic design history in Portugal. And that's how the project Errata started. The first main goal of Errata was and still is to raise awareness of women's contributions that have been overlooked, ignored, and forgotten, and in doing so, reveal the mechanisms still present that consent to these omissions. So Errata started as a research project that I was developing on my own free time, in parallel to a full-time job as a designer. I was slowly cooking it until in 2020, I applied with my friend Olinda Martins to the Criatório grant. Criatório is a grant from the Porto municipality here in Portugal. And we applied with a proposal for an exhibition about 4 women graphic designers. And these 4 women that were the basis of this project are Maria Kell, Cristina Reis, Alda Rosa, and Cândida Ruivo. And we, at the time, thought that the work of these 4 women together represented very well the 20th century graphic design history in Portugal. Because Maria Kell started working more or less in the beginning of the century, before design was even called design. Then Alda Rosa and Cristina Reis were both part of a group of people that went to London in the 60s to study design. So they did a design BA outside of Portugal, and then they returned, and they were part of this group that created the first design exhibition in Portugal. And also they were very involved in the process of institutionalization of the discipline in the 60s. So they're very important for those reasons. And then lastly, Cândida Ruivo and her work with the music newspaper Blitz represents very well the 80s and the end of the century, when the new democracy, after the fall of the dictatorship in Portugal, opened the country to various musical and cultural influences. And also Cândida is part of the group of the first people in Portugal that graduated in design here in Lisbon. So For these reasons, these 4 women and their work seemed ideal for us for an exhibition about forgotten women in design. But when in May 2020 we found out that we had won the Creatorio grant, the work really began, and we really started doing our research. And one of the very first steps was to get in contact with 3 of these 4 women, because Maria Kel is no longer alive. And even though we couldn't speak to her, we could speak to people that were very that knew a lot about her work. And when we started talking with these women, we understood that they knew a lot of other women in design that had been their contemporaries, women that had studied with them, women that had been their references. And so very quickly, by only talking to a couple of women, we started having a much bigger group of women and their work to talk about in this exhibition. And so if initially our research question was, are there any women in Portuguese design history? Because we didn't know any. The fact that so many other women could so quickly come to our attention through simple research methods implied that the issue was not exactly a lack of women in the profession. The issue is that the process of documenting and remembering is inherently misogynistic. And so we realized that this was the wrong question, and instead we should be asking, why are women absent from design history? What mechanisms have permitted these omissions, and why have women who were notable during their careers been forgotten? And these questions bring a lot of other questions to the table. For example, who makes history? Who has the power to decide who makes it to the canon? And is history making a neutral process? Is design neutral? Etc. And so I started realizing that part of the problem of design and history was the construction of this canon that was very that was full of white men, and the construction of this narrative of the design hero that is highlighted by retrospectives and monographic books, etc. And so I started thinking that just adding women to this canon, adding women to this list of notable people wasn't enough. We didn't want to perpetuate the same hero and artifact kind of narrative that we saw in graphic design history, and we didn't like. And so as we were starting to prepare the exhibition, there was a constant question in the back of our minds: how can we show the work of these women without it being merely an addition to the canon? Aren't we also perpetuating the hero narrative by talking about women instead of men? Aren't we also perpetuating the artifact obsession by showing tables of their work and nothing else? So we considered a lot of curatorial approaches. I can't remember which ideas came first, but we were trying to think of ways of organizing the objects that could show the work, but not highlight the designers themselves, to go against this idea of the hero. And so first, I considered showing the work chronologically, but then rejected it because it felt too much like a standard linear narrative of design history. Then I considered organizing the exhibition by type of object, books together, posters together, etc. But it felt too object-centered. And then I arrived to a solution that I thought for a long time was a very good one, which was stripping any mode of formal organization altogether and create a long corridor of tables with the objects that would be organized by a kind of free association. And I have a mock-up of that here just to show, there's this poster that was designed by Maria Kel with a girl holding a bird, the pink and white poster in the corner that says 1979. And we thought, okay, this bird in the poster could then lead us to other objects with birds. which there's a cover by Assunção Cordovil with a bird in it, and then there's a record cover by Judith Cilia with a bird. There's another poster by Maria Kell with a bird, and then that poster is blue, so we can have a blue cover with a woman talking to children, and then this would lead us to a lot of other books with children and women on the covers, and then other covers with just women, etc. So you can see the idea here, and the works would then be numbered, and they would be organized. They would have some kind of labeling system, and then a selection of different maps to plot different routes through the exhibition would be given to the people when they enter the exhibition. For example, if you wanted to follow the work of one particular designer, there was one route. If you wanted to follow the political work, you'd follow a different route. If you wanted to follow cultural work, you'd follow a different route. So at the time, I liked this solution a lot because it was a very clear attempt to flatten any kind of hierarchy. The different routes were a way of presenting several possible curatorial perspectives, almost like a way of exposing how the curatorial process happens. Here's a bunch of works that could be organized like this or like this or like this, depending on what you're looking for. And even though it was almost silly, almost it was nonsensical almost in a way, it was also a very clear way of saying there is no neutral way of showing the work. There is no neutral way of doing curation. There is no way of selecting, of not highlighting anyone. So this is the only way we could do this. But then we thought it's also quite complex to navigate this. It's quite cryptical. And I realized that for the general public coming to see the exhibition, if the work was shown in this way, a lot of people wouldn't engage with it, and definitely they wouldn't come out of the exhibition with 17 new names of designers in their heads, of women designers that they haven't heard of before. So in the end, I thought this idea is actually obfuscating the women and their work instead of presenting it. So after many weeks of what felt a lot of backs and forths at the time, and quite frustrating attempts of trying to organize this exhibition, we went back to this original aim of Errata, to raise awareness of women's contributions and to reveal the mechanisms that consent to these omissions. So with this in mind, there are many mechanisms that result in the oppression and exclusion of women from history. One exhibition couldn't show them all, but in this exhibition, we settled on three broad terms: home, narrative, and institution, to frame some of these mechanisms which have a direct effect both on how women work and how the work is seen by design history. So for this talk, I'm going to explain very briefly each of these terms and each of these sections in the exhibition. So home explores the persistence of patriarchal systems in which the norms and structures of both the design world and broader social landscape restrict women's opportunities and define the way in which their contributions are interpreted and recorded. Graphic arts was a practice common to all artists in the beginning of the century in Portugal, the 20th century. But female artists were by a large part commissioned to work on educational books for women and for children, which were often also written by women. Even though male artists were also working on books for children, commissioning women mainly for this kind of work was a reflection on the limited role they had in society. They were often closed in an environment of domesticity as mothers and wives. And so the books you see here, for example, these were No Reino do Sol was a book for primary school in Portugal at the time. The one in the middle, Aventuras de Cinco Irmãozinhos, is part of a project called Biblioteca dos Pequeninos, which was a library created by a woman feminist that wanted to create loads of books for children to make the country more alphabetized, because at the time Portugal was very illiterate. And here you see on the top left corner a book that is especially for mothers and babies. It's a book where mothers can collect information about the first year of their babies, when the first teeth appeared, when they started walking, etc. And a lot of the objects presented in this part, in the section of the exhibition, were very much designed for children and women, as I was saying. But we also decided to include a last table with some work by some women that actively wanted to engage with this idea and wanted to criticize this idea, and they wanted to show women outside of domestic life. And so this last table had a book by Maria Lamas about women in Portugal. It had several other more political objects, but I wanted to highlight this particular one, which are 4 stamps designed by Maria Kell in the year after the dictatorship fell, created for the International Year of Women. And she decided to represent women outside of the home, and not as a mother, not as a wife, but actively engaged in professional work. So the woman as a nurse, as working in agriculture, working in a factory, and working in an office. Of course, these are still, from today's eyes, these are still quite sexist representations of women, maybe. For example, the woman as a nurse and not a doctor. But for the time, I think these were quite mind-opening and challenging the notion of what women could do in the country at that point. The second section was called Narrative, and this one was more focused in this idea, in contradicting this idea of the hero designer, and very much based on a text by Martha Scotford called Neat History versus Messy History, where she presents several alternatives to the designer hero, and she thinks that in these alternatives, that's where we can find and we can look for women designers, and these are the non-famous, the designers that work amongst the team, the designers that work in several different types of work, not just graphic design, but incorporate several other areas, the designers that don't work full-time, the designers that stop for a while because they become mothers, etc. And so this section was highlighting how design history focus on the heroic narrative of the usually male individual and their artifacts comes at the expense of more nuanced stories. So the common hero-led story that we've been accustomed to in design history usually is made by a clear progression of a designer that follows a path of apprentice to a male master, learn the trade, become a boss, and name the practice after yourself, then eventually become the master to a new apprentice, resulting often in the exclusion of women whose practice was more multidisciplinary. But design is most often a varied, collaborative, and collective effort. Those women who have worked not always under their own name, but in various collaborations with different collaborators, sometimes within studios, sometimes independently, present a difficulty for the conventional design history. And so this section in the exhibition showed the work of women that did exactly that. They, for example, I bring here a specific example of Nessa Antelmo, which is a designer in Porto, that followed a very labyrinthic route in her career. She started working she actually started as a musician, and within the band, she created the record covers and the costumes for the band and the stage design for that band, while she was also one of the singers. And then she worked for a very famous designer in Porto called João Nunes. Then she opened a design studio with Ana Menezes called Pan Design. Then Pan Design joined João Nunes again, and then they split again, and now Ness and Telmo works individually. So as an historian, to look for the work of someone like Ness and Telmo, you have to look through different signatures, different collective names, individual names. And so it is more work to establish this path in this career. It's not, the work will be dispersed in different archives with different people, etc. And there were other, I also here is some work from Alda Rosa, a designer I spoke briefly about in the beginning of this talk. Alda Rosa was for a long time a designer within INI, which is the Instituto de Investigação Industrial, which translates as Institute for Research on Industry. Which was an institute inside the government. And so a lot of the things she produced as a graphic designer, they stayed within this institute and they didn't come out, they weren't commercialized, they weren't seen by the public outside. So for that reason, she became a little bit hidden from the public eye. And at the same time, she was doing some books for publishers outside, but they happen only occasionally. They weren't very regular work, so it wasn't, her name didn't become so popular. The third section of the exhibition was called Institution. And this section considers the work of women that work within publications, within publishers and other institutions, arguing against the predominant idea that success can be measured only by an identifiable authorial voice or a wide and varied portfolio of different projects. So there's this idea in design that comes, I think it's an inheritance from art history, where the designer to be successful has to be identified. His work, usually it's a man, has to be identifiable by certain characteristics, either because you look to the poster and you think, oh yes, that person, that is definitely designed by that person and no one else. And this excludes a lot of designers from the record. There's those who work for a single publication for many years, for example, they don't have a varied portfolio, or people that work within institutions because they don't follow the binary of designer-client because they're in-house designers. They are excluded from this kind of history. And also the ones that don't have this signature because they don't want to have the signature, or because they have a more chameleonic kind of work, they are also excluded from this kind of history. So in this section, we had the work of 3 designers. There was Cândida Ruivo that I spoke briefly about before with Blitz. So she was the designer. She was part of the team that started this newspaper. This newspaper, music newspaper, was very famous in Portugal in the 80s and then 90s. It really represented the mood of that generation that was coming out of the dictatorship and absorbing all of these influences from abroad. Before internet, this was the only source of information about bands, etc. So it was very popular amongst music lovers. And Cândida designed it for 20 years. And so she did hundreds of covers, hundreds of interior pages, but because she only did this project and nothing else, her work has been excluded from the canon. There was also this other designer called Fátima Duarte, who was the designer of Valentim Carvalho, music publisher here in Portugal, also again for 20 years almost. And because she was designing record, so this publisher at the time was the only music publisher in the country pretty much. So all kinds of artists came through this publisher, from like classical music to Pimba musicians to rock musicians to band. This cover shown here, which was a very experimental band. So Fatima didn't think it was a good strategy to have an authorial voice. She thought she should adapt her design to each artist that she was working with, because she thought the covers should represent more of the artist's identity than her own. And so because of that, her work is not identifiable as coming from one designer. But also this reflects that design work never comes only from one person. It's always a collaborative process that involves the client, involves the printers, involves the person that writes the copy, involves a massive team. And so it is, of course, more than normal that the final object represents many hands rather than one only hand of the designer. Also, the exhibition at the end had these erratas to sort of play with the name of the exhibition. So these were loose sheets that people could gather at the end of the exhibition. And they were our way of including facts and biographical data about the designers that an exhibition that only shows graphic objects doesn't allow you to do. So, for example, one of the designers in the exhibition is called Assunção Cordovil, and she was a designer started her career around the 70s, and she's still working today. And she developed a very a role of a manager over the years. She became very good at receiving the briefs from the client, translating those briefs to the design team of the design studio she worked in, to working out the budget and all the production that is involved in any design project. And so her work is incredibly important to a healthy design studio, especially if you want to be financially healthy. But it's impossible. It's a kind of work that gets completely invisible if you only show artifacts in an exhibition, because it's a work that happens behind the curtain and it's not translated into an object. And so these errata sheets allowed us to tell this story, to add these biographies to the conversation. Also, at the beginning of the exhibition, there was a very simple black and white catalog that people could collect. It was free. And this catalog showed all the objects in the exhibition as in black and white, as you can see here. The images had different scales because they were all in proportion to their right side, to their real sizes. So, for example, the object you see on the bottom right corner was a very big poster, so it appears bigger than the 3 covers of Eva that you see at the top, because they're respecting their real sizes. But more importantly, what we wanted to do in this catalog was organize the objects in a completely different way than we did in the exhibition. So here, the objects are organized by alphabetical order of the designer. And we did this because we wanted to show that, going back to what I was talking about when I was explaining different curatorial approaches that we considered, we wanted to make sure that that the public knew that we were aware that curating an exhibition is never a neutral process. So by showing the objects organized in a different way, we're showing different relationships between them. We're creating different bridges, and we're saying to you, okay, this could have been a completely different organization of the exhibition itself. We're also very aware that the exhibition presented the work of a group of very privileged white women, mostly from Lisbon and some of them from Porto, but from no other geographies in the country. And so at the end, we had a text in the wall that was explaining that we were aware of this omission as well, that we were also creating as curators, and had a little provocation in the end, inviting people to add more women to the canon if they wanted to, by looking outside of the selection that we did. And so I bring this quote from Sheila Levrand-Bretfield, who is a feminist designer that I really admire. And she says, the issue of equality broadens beyond women to involve the equality of all voices. Feminist design looks for graphic strategies that will enable us to listen to people who have not been heard before. And so I also kind of end this talk with this quote again as a provocation for anyone to join this conversation and add more missing histories to the mainstream history that we know. And just to say that Errate, as Nuno was saying, exists as a website as well, errate.design, where you can see the manifesto, photos of the exhibition, access the podcast, and also download that little catalog I was talking about. And there's also the podcast, which the last episode was almost a year ago. I had a little break because I was on maternity leave, but soon new episodes are going to be released. So keep an eye out for it. And here are the addresses of the website and our Instagram account as well.
Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you, Nuno, for
that was very interesting, and I hope everyone watching, if they were facing this kind of theoretical framework and this way that you look into design, I hope if it was the first time they thought about this, I hope they kind of sink in, let these thoughts sink in to reflect on their professional environment. Anyway, there's a few questions I would like to post to start this conversation. So I don't know if you like to stop sharing your.
Oh, of course.
No, it's okay. Then we can have a double screen. I hope it was enough time for people to write your the website and anyway. So something something I retained from your presentation, and this was not the first presentation I saw, like talking about this topic, is you mentioned that in your presentation, but I would like you to talk a little bit more. Like, is you question the concept of success? What is what is considered to be a successful designer? Mm-hmm. And obviously, there's many designers that for instance, that they mention working for big names and mostly corporate brands and companies, big companies in their CVs and in their portfolios as a validation for their work. So I think your presentation was clear on that, but and I think by showing some examples of that of designers, women designers that challenge that way of success. There's a double question in this. Like, is it were do you think it was considered successful back then, or is just you in 2023 looking back and saying that that can be considered success? Were they considered being successful designers when they were working? Apparently not, because they're not being published in books, and I never heard about most of those women in when I was a design student. And the second thing is, the second part of the question is, how do you envision, for instance, a monography or a design book that could be developed around the concept of your concept of success?
Those are two very good questions. Starting with the first one, I think there's a mixture. I think for sure some of the women that were presented in the Errata exhibition were not considered successful while they were working in design, especially the last one I showed, Fatima Duarte, for sure, even though I think that if we go and look in the library of our grandparents or our parents, their library of records, we'll find a lot of records that she designed. So she was on everyone's house, if they were music lovers, I suppose. Yet her name was completely unfamiliar to everyone. Others, while I was doing my research, some of the designers presented in the exhibition, they appear in, for example, in design magazines of the 90s and the early 2000s. Their work is shown in these magazines, and they were presented in exhibitions, and they won prizes, like prizes from the design center in Portugal that no longer exists, but for example, Nessan Telmo is one of these cases. I think her work was quite known, especially in Porto at that time that she was working. But then it just wasn't. But then today, as historians, we're not documenting that kind of work, or we don't see it documented. So I think this. I think there's a lot of problems with this idea of success. First, or one of the problems is that one of the very popular vehicles to show design work and to document design work is the monograph. And the monograph book is this kind of book that has a little essay in the beginning, and then it's just full of big images of a career. And that kind of book really only works with a specific kind of career. So a career that is very varied, it has this recognizable voice. Otherwise, for example, if you want to do a book like that about Candida Ruivo Duarte and Blitz, you're just going to have Blitz and Blitz and Blitz in hundreds of pages. And some people might find that boring. I wouldn't, but I think some people would. And so I think one of the ways of defying this idea of success is finding other ways of documenting and presenting designers' works, not monographs. And for example, I think, for example, there's a collection of books called Hall of Fames, and they're more interested in talking with the designers and having the interviews and recording their oral histories than and they're not so interested in showing images and images and images of their work. So I think, for example, this is a very good alternative to the monograph and a very good other way of speaking and discussing design. So be more concentrated on what their experiences were actually as practitioners, and what were the the conflicts they found at work, the successes the things that they thought were successful in their day-to-day, not like the prizes they won. Or and the other problem, I think, comes a lot with education. I don't know if this is still true in design courses today, but when I was studying design, it was very clear that this path of joining a design studio as an intern, and then eventually in 10, 20 years opening your own design studio, was the ideal that was sort of ingrained in our minds. This is what we all aspire to do. And this neglects a lot of design work that is not done in that way. People work in magazines and newspapers, in massive companies. There's so many other ways of doing design. And I feel like if by education we only present these kind of examples to students, it also creates almost an embarrassment when you do go to real life and you don't find that your career is following that path. This happened to me personally. I felt like a failure for a really long time because I didn't think I was following that route. And so that made me, of course, challenge this way of success. And I think we need to be less focused on that as the only example. I don't know if I answered the questions.
Perfectly. I'm trying to, your answer links to the second question that I have here. Like you mentioned, education, and obviously I'm a teacher, designer, but also a teacher. And so also when I became a teacher, I became really aware of the role of teaching and the responsibility of teaching. And I started to, because I was working from within the education sector, I was more aware of these dynamics that when I was a student, I didn't question that much.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, if a teacher said something in class, I would never think of challenging that, because that's the authority, and obviously is his or she is older, and he knows better than me, is better informed, read more books than me, so probably the information that this person in front of me is giving me is solid, complete truth, etc. So, but my question is, well, it's on education, but it's more about the role of teaching the teachers. I don't know if you have numbers, how many women teachers, design teachers, and men design teachers are in Portugal. But the question is not focused on that. It's more about on, for instance, design history curricula. What design history is being taught? Your focus is Portugal. So what design history is being taught in Portugal? How many Portuguese designers are being taught to students? Because like I sense from my experience that not many Portuguese design students know much about the design is being done in their own country. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. How can we, within education, not design history, but within design education in Portugal, can we challenge this Western-centered, Eurocentric view that, for instance, what we've been taught as a good design is mainly from other countries in Europe, US, or well, US is not in Europe, but US, England, Germany, Netherlands, it's always looking beyond our borders to as a good design references. What's your thoughts on that, like on the education / Eurocentric view and etc.
Yeah. Well, I think the only, well, first, I don't have the numbers. This is something I would like to gather as now for my PhD. And we should say as for transparency that Nuno is my PhD supervisor.
Disclaimer.
So you know that
one of the supervisors.
One of the supervisors, exactly. So you know that I would like to gather this information. How many what's the gender balance in students, in teachers, what's in the design history curriculum in all the schools. This is something that really interests me. I don't have the data for it, but what I know in my experience, yes, it was very male and Northern Europe and Northern American focused, and this is this is very clear once you analyze the literature in graphic design history, that a lot of the books that we have in the libraries in universities, they are written by English or American people about their context, and then countries like Portugal and most of the Southern European countries, their history of design is relates to that center. Is always it's always in
relation to,
yes, and it's always happens always with a delay. And the case of the Portuguese institutionalization of design is very representative of that, because as I briefly said, that Alda Rosa and Cristina Reis, they were part of a group that went to design to London in the 60s to study design, and this is a very clear acknowledgement that London or the United Kingdom at that point was a design center, and Portuguese designers went there to learn, and then they came back to their country to sort of reveal what they had learned. And so whatever was being done in the UK then was copied, let's say, in Portugal. And this happened in a lot of other countries. It's very common. And the same happens with Portuguese design histories. It kind of follows the path of other histories that have already been written. And for example, one of the most important or one of the most used books in graphic design history is the Philip Meggs one. And Philip Meggs' book has like hundreds and hundreds of men represented in it, and then like 15 women or something like this. So if that is the one book that you use as your starting point to write design history or to teach design history, that's already a very biased account of history, a very white male, Northern Europe, Northern America focused example. So I think as educators, we need to challenge these notions of history and try to look for more marginalized stories. And I think because my PhD is focused on precisely trying to understand how we can write a feminist revision of design history, and I don't have the answer yet, but I think part of that solution is also acknowledging everyone that works in a design project. So, for example, at the moment I'm organizing with Nina Paing and Maya Ober from Future S. We're organizing a feminist festival of publishing and design in Porto. And our idea is, the whole idea behind it is that we want to give voice not just to the designers that make feminist publications, but also the writers, also the copy editors, the booksellers, the bookmakers, because everyone is involved in this process and everyone deserves a voice. And I think part of, like the quote I ended with, by Sheila, it's not just about giving visibility to women, it's about all voices. And I think once we start to acknowledge this, everything will become more balanced, more fair, more inclusive.
So, like acknowledging that design is a collective creation, not like
Yes.
not just from a single person. So, yeah.
Yes.
And
The genius designer behind the computer.
yes, and because you mentioned that yeah, you have this feminist perspective, I would like to hear your thoughts on the intersectionality, because like obviously your project is focused on women, but there's many other levels that could be brought into these, like obviously these women that you've been studying, they were part of I would say, I don't know how to say, but like middle class that could have could have the money to go to London to study. Or so I'm thinking about other social categorizations like race, class, gender, sexuality that could be applied to design history, not only having women as a central thing. So how would you address in your project if you're in your, for instance, this festival, if you'll bring other questions besides not only
Oh, of course.
yeah. So I would like to hear on that, like how could this absence of women in design history could, like the same thought and the same methodology could be applied about, for instance, the lack of Black people in design in Portugal, like not in just in history, but in today, or LGBT people, or etc., etc., etc. How can these identities are? So how you address that in from your perspective, all these the intersectionality?
Yes, by the way, the festival is called etc. because it's always and etc. and etc. and etc. When you start talking about the subject, there's always when you start including people, there's always more to include. So that's why we call it etc. I think, of course, this is the reason why women have been excluded from histories, because these histories of women are harder to find. And the reason Errata only has histories of white privileged women is because with the time I had in hands and with the resources I had, within all the histories that have been marginalized, those are the ones I could access to. I didn't have the resources to go even deeper. And because, of course, the reason, I assume the reason the collections I talked about only have, for example, it's relatively easy to do a book about Sebastião Rodrigues because there's already several books about him and there's already been exhibitions about him. So it's quite easy to gather that information. It's not so easy to do that about a person that has not have had, that no one has written about, and there's nothing online about them. So the first layer of people like I found was that more privileged one. I think digging deeper, we will find more. And of course, in design, there's also a hierarchy of what is considered to be design and what's not considered to be design. So, for example, if we're looking for people that have professionalized themselves in design, that have managed to do BA in design in the 60s and 70s, of course, we're only going to find white privileged women, because it was very difficult for people of other minorities to access education in universities. So I think once we also start to broaden this idea of what design is, we can start finding other voices that come from other practices, like maybe someone that worked in a printer, maybe someone that was a writer but kind of designed their own books or something, or someone that had a grocery shop and did their own flyers or their own, I don't know, bags. I think once we're not so focused on what is a designed object and open more possibilities to this quite constrained category, we can start to include people from other backgrounds, social backgrounds, other geographies, other economic backgrounds, etc. This is also the problem of the snowball sampling, which was the kind of research I did of like finding other women through. So if I went to talk with Alda Rosa, of course she's only gonna tell me about her friends and her colleagues, and that are kind of similar to her in her social and economical backgrounds. So my purpose with my PhD is also to kind of come out of that sample of women and start looking in archives and other places to see if I can find work coming from other places.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just checking the online. There's no questions. That's why I keep asking you questions. I don't know, like we've been here for an hour now, and maybe I can post like one more question, and I would like to going back to education, something that you said about on education, and because like this is an event mainly for students, but we open to the community. That's why we transmit this online. But I would like to, because you mentioned that design students, they have this preconceived idea of what a good career or a career of success is. So, and from my experience, there's lots of expectations of when the master students they follow to their final year, the second year of the masters, and there's an internship at the end.
Mm-hmm.
The last semester, and so we open a call to lots of companies and other entities, not necessarily commercial ones, but also research centers, etc. And I sense that they have this, the vast majority, they have this urge to apply to companies because they kind of see as the first step towards like this preconceived idea of a career of success, and also because they just wanna enter the market. To gain some experience as working as designer in a company. And so why I'm saying this is because you already mentioned that this didn't happen to you in that way, like and then that and I'm quoting you felt like a failure because something didn't work as you thought, because that's what you heard before. So what I want to ask, and I want to focus on the project that you're developing, because not only so you're doing this research as a PhD researcher, you find the ways and you found the conditions to develop this project, and this is also working in design. So I would like to ask you a double question that it intertwined. First is how do you see, because you've been working as a designer in London, but how do you see this shift for becoming a design researcher, and also because you wanted to make errata and you make it happen because you applied to funding. So I would like to hear from you how you can create your own conditions to do the work that you really want to do because you find it that's the most important thing to do with design. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I also want to say that, you know, I also have a very privileged experience, and I managed to, or in other words, I completely understand if someone wants to go and work for a big company and make money and have a wage, and that's great. One thing that's, you know, one thing that is, it can sound very glamorous to look for funding and do your own projects, but it can also be a very precarious way of living. You know, as an example, for example, I have this grant from FCT to do my PhD for the next 3 years. It's a 4-year grant, but I don't, which is, to me, it sounds amazing. And within the Portuguese context, I think having a salary, even though it's not a super great salary, but a salary for 4 years, this is a great privilege. But there's nothing after those 4 years, which and there's other problems with being a bolseiro rather than an employee. But in my case in particular is that I also found that I was working for a long time. I was working for 10 years, and I was working in publication. So I worked in studios under other people's names and under other people's kinds of work. So as a designer, I had to sort of learn how to do design as other people, because I was working in their studio. And then I moved to publications, and I was doing you know, a little bit like Candida with Blitz. I was doing magazine after magazine after magazine, but in terms of what was visible in my portfolio, there, you know, 5 or 6 years of work are translated into one project in a website, and that feels very weak. Or it felt very weak to me at the time. I can see now that that's not true. And because I had this, for a long time, this idea that success was you having your own studio, because that was sold to me during university as a you know, almost one of the only ways to succeed in design. And I wasn't finding it very easy to do that. I thought this was a failure, but then actually I looked back and thought, no, I've been working as a designer in several places for the last 12 years. That is actually a very big privilege. But the reason I wanted to switch to research is because I felt that as a practitioner, I was becoming more and more separated from design thinking and design writing. And I no longer felt, and I think this is a big problem. Designers usually work quite hard and quite late, and they don't have time to read, and they don't have time to see talks, and they don't have time to you know, be engaged with all of these other. And so it seems that, to me, it felt that there were two worlds. There's the world of doing design, and there's the world of writing about design. And I lost contact with the world of critical thinking. And so the reason I wanted to do this Start Errata was also because I felt the need to engage again with writing and reading. And also because when I started doing the research for the exhibition, I could see that there was a lot more that needed to be done, and I didn't have time to do it with also working full-time as a designer. So that was the solution I encountered. But I think, you know, I never worked for big companies. I always worked for small studios. And I think I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed small teams, and I enjoyed, you know, working directly with clients and things like that. I think other people will enjoy other things. I think mostly what what is important is to challenge things. If you know, not everything that happens on Instagram is true, and just you know, acknowledging that design can happen in a variety of ways as a practitioner will also allow people that are not just working in design studios or big companies to feel successful. But if we open this conversation to and show that design is also working in printers, is also working in a variety of other places, will also be more realistic to what design actually is, but will also, I think, help people feel more, what's the word? Gratified with their work and happy with their path. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Oh, perfectly. Thank you. I'll keep that thought, gratification. So we don't have any questions from the audience. It's a very quiet audience. So I think we just like it's 6:15, so let's give it a go. Like I don't know if you like to add something else, Isabel.
No, I think I
We covered pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Isabel, again.
Thank you
It's a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm just wrapping up. So this was the last session of Ciclo de Conversas, Design Multimédia. It's a cycle of talks that we invite designers every year to speak to our students of the bachelor and master degrees of Design and Multimedia in the University of Coimbra. So we will, in a few months, we'll start to prepare the 2024 edition. So hope to see you there. Maybe in person, we're discussing that, but maybe online, we don't know. So see you next year. And Isabel, thank you again. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.